My wife's family pushed me to the brink, and they were completely unprepared for how I responded. I'm 32 years old, and for much of my marriage, I've been caught in an exhausting tug-of-war with my wife's family. Her father is domineering, her two brothers are constantly meddling, and I've spent years trying to assert myself while keeping the peace. It's been draining, and honestly, I've had enough. When I first married my wife, I assumed her family's involvement was just over-enthusiasm. She assured me they meant well, and while they could be a bit much, it was all rooted in love. But as time went on, their behavior started to feel less like enthusiasm and more like an attempt to control our lives. Her father, in particular, never misses a chance to criticize me. Whether it's during family get-togethers, on the phone, or in casual conversation, he always finds something to nitpick. According to him, my cooking lacks authenticity, my job is unstable, and my fashion choices leave much to be desired. And that's just scratching the surface. Worse yet, he acts as though boundaries don't apply to him. Early in our marriage, I'd often be startled by a loud knock at our door, only to find him standing there unannounced. It didn't matter if it was early Sunday morning or late at night, he'd show up like he owned the place. If I mentioned we'd appreciate some notice before he came over, he'd laugh and dismiss me with, "We're family. I don't need an invitation." Her brothers weren't much better. They acted like his loyal sidekicks, backing him up on everything and reinforcing his behavior. They even had a family group chat where they'd gossip, conveniently leaving me out. Every so often, I'd hear through mutual friends what was being said, and unsurprisingly, it was never anything kind. The breaking point came after my wife and I returned from a short vacation. We'd taken the trip to escape the chaos, but when we got back, I barely recognized our living room. Without asking, my father-in-law had taken it upon himself to revamp our space. He rearranged the furniture, hung new curtains, and even painted one of the walls in a color I despised. He proudly explained how he'd roped my brothers-in-law into the project, making it a whole event. When I confronted him about this blatant overstep, he shrugged it off with, "I thought I was helping. Your living room needed a bit more flair." My wife tried to mediate, but instead of supporting me, she downplayed the situation. "He probably thought he was doing something nice," she said, brushing aside my concerns. This wasn't about the living room. It was about how our autonomy and space were being blatantly disregarded. Things only got worse after that. My father-in-law spun his own version of events to the rest of the family, painting me as ungrateful and overly controlling. Soon after, I noticed cryptic social media posts from her brothers, thinly veiled jabs about toxic people and drama queens. While I chose not to respond, it was exhausting to deal with these passive-aggressive digs. Not long after the living room fiasco, my father-in-law decided to invite himself over for dinner, except he didn't come alone. He brought along two of his friends, people I had never met, and announced he thought it would be a great opportunity for us all to get acquainted. Caught completely off guard, I scrambled to throw together enough food while trying to hide my frustration. After dinner, I told him, calmly but firmly, that we would appreciate some advance notice before he came over in the future. He nodded, smiled, and completely disregarded what I'd said. The very next week, he showed up again, unannounced, this time holding a pie. When I reminded him of our conversation about calling ahead, he laughed it off, saying, "It's just a pie, I didn't think it'd be a problem." My wife, ever the peacekeeper, tried to defuse the situation. "He doesn't mean any harm," she insisted. "He's just not used to these kinds of rules." By then, I felt like I was losing my grip on reality. Everyone else seemed to accept this chaos as normal, except me. The hardest part was the lack of support from my wife. She often said she understood my frustrations, but when it came time to set boundaries, she would always side with her dad, prioritizing his feelings over ours. I started to feel completely isolated, like I was fighting this battle alone. Eventually, I began questioning whether our marriage could survive under these conditions. I loved my wife deeply, but her unwillingness to stand up to her family was slowly eroding the trust and partnership we had built together. That's when I decided enough was enough. I was no longer willing to live in this constant state of anxiety, wondering when the next intrusion or passive-aggressive comment would occur. I started formulating a plan to take back control, not just of my home, but of my sanity. If my wife wasn't going to stand up for us, I realized I'd have to do it myself. This was no longer just about setting boundaries, it was about reclaiming the life I wanted, free from the chaos her family had brought into it. Update 1. One evening, I sat my wife down for a serious conversation. I laid everything on the table, explaining how her father and brothers were interfering in our lives, how draining it was to deal with their overbearing behavior, and how it was putting a strain on our marriage. She listened quietly, nodding at times, but when I asked her to confront her family, she hesitated. "I don't want to make things worse," she said, clearly uncomfortable. She eventually promised to talk to them, but I wasn't convinced she would follow through. A few days later, my father-in-law dropped by again, unannounced, carrying a tray of cookies. When I opened the door, he acted like nothing had happened, cheerfully saying he forgot about the new rule to call ahead. I stood my ground and told him he couldn't come in without prior notice. His expression darkened, and he accused me of being disrespectful, claiming I was trying to drive a wedge between him and his daughter. I calmly repeated myself and closed the door. Instead of leaving, he sat on our porch, muttering loudly about how ungrateful I was. When my wife came home, she found him still sitting there, clearly upset. To my shock, she was annoyed at me. She told me I'd overreacted and escalated the situation unnecessarily. It felt like everything we discussed a few days earlier had been completely forgotten. At that point, I decided to start documenting every interaction I had with her father and brothers. I figured if things continued to spiral, having a clear record of their behavior might be useful. Not long after, I found out through a mutual friend that my father-in-law was organizing a family meeting to address my behavior. Naturally, I wasn't invited. When I confronted my wife about it, she admitted she knew about the meeting but didn't think it was a big deal. She reassured me it was just an attempt to clear the air, but I didn't feel reassured at all. The day after the meeting, I started noticing subtle shifts in how her brothers treated me. They began sending smug, passive-aggressive texts, implying that the family had unanimously agreed I was the problem. The tipping point came when I overheard my wife on the phone with her father. He was casually mentioning a family dinner he was planning, at our house. He hadn't asked or even informed me. He was simply organizing it as though it was his personal space. When I confronted my wife about it, she shrugged and said, "It's just a dinner. Maybe it's better if we go along with it, it'll avoid more conflict." I was livid. This wasn't just about the dinner, it was about the blatant lack of respect for our home and the dismissive attitude toward my feelings. That's when I decided to take matters into my own hands. I called my father-in-law directly and cancelled the dinner. He was furious, accusing me of trying to isolate my wife from her family and threatening to cut off contact if I didn't stop this nonsense. The fallout was immediate. My wife came home from work visibly upset. She told me her father had called her in tears, claiming I was ruining their relationship. She looked genuinely hurt and said I was being too rigid. I didn't argue. I simply told her, "If you won't stand up for us, I will. But I can't keep doing this alone." Update 2. After the cancelled dinner, the situation escalated even further. I gave my wife an ultimatum: either she started setting firm boundaries with her family, or I'd have to consider taking more drastic steps, including the possibility of separating. She looked stunned but reluctantly agreed to have a one-on-one meeting with her father to address the issues. I stayed out of it, letting her take the lead. When the day came, I overheard parts of their conversation from upstairs. Her father dismissed her concerns outright, saying, "This is just how we are as a family. If he can't handle it, that's his problem." When she brought up my frustration, he doubled down, accusing me of being overly sensitive and controlling. After he left, my wife admitted that the conversation hadn't gone well. I told her plainly, "This was your chance to show me you're serious about supporting me. I hope it's not the last one." Things took a darker turn soon after. Her brothers started ramping up their harassment, filling social media with thinly veiled jabs about people who don't understand family values and selfish spouses tearing families apart. I blocked them, but it didn't stop the rumors and whispers from reaching me through mutual acquaintances. Then came the breaking point. One afternoon, I heard commotion outside and saw my father-in-law standing on our porch, with a locksmith. He was attempting to change the locks, claiming he had every right to access his daughter's house. I immediately called the police. When they arrived, my father-in-law tried to play the victim, accusing me of treating him like a criminal. The locksmith quickly left, and the officers explained that he had no legal right to access our home. He finally left, but not without creating a dramatic scene. When my wife came home and I told her what had happened, she was livid at me. "You should have called me first," she said. "There was no need to involve the police." I was stunned. "He was trying to take over our home," I said. "If this doesn't convince you to stand up for us, I don't know what will." I realized then that if I wanted change, I had to take more decisive action. Update 3. I took a week off work to clear my head and come up with a strategy. During this time, I found a spare key hidden in a drawer. It didn't take me long to figure out that my father-in-law had been using it to let himself into our house whenever he pleased. Furious, I changed all the locks that same day and made sure the spare keys were secure. When I confronted my wife, she admitted she'd given him the key years ago and never asked for it back. "I didn't think it was a big deal," she said quietly. "It's a big deal now," I replied. The next time my father-in-law tried to show up unannounced, he found himself locked out. He called my wife to complain, but to my surprise, she told him there was nothing she could do about it. I could see that she was starting to understand how serious I was. But it didn't stop there. Her father contacted a family lawyer, claiming he had rights to access the house because it was his daughter's home. Thankfully, the lawyer told him he had no legal standing, but the lengths he was willing to go to shocked me. Determined to protect myself further, I finalized ownership documents for the house in my name and my wife's. This gave me a sense of control I hadn't felt in years. Around this time, my wife began stepping back from her family. She skipped a few gatherings and started limiting phone calls with her father and brothers. For the first time, I felt like she was truly on my side. Update 4. The tension between us and her family reached its peak after my wife's growing distance became obvious. Her father decided to take drastic measures, staging a public intervention during a family gathering we didn't attend. He invited mutual friends and extended relatives, painting me as controlling and manipulative, claiming I was tearing the family apart. I found out when some attendees reached out, asking for my side of the story. I calmly explained the situation and provided evidence of the intrusive behavior, screenshots, text messages, and records of unannounced visits. To my surprise, several of them admitted they had noticed similar patterns in her father's behavior over the years. The turning point came shortly after, at another family event where her father attempted to air his grievances again. This time, my wife stood up to him in front of everyone. She told him, firmly but respectfully, that his behavior had been unacceptable and that she supported me fully. Her father was furious. He threatened to disown her unless she divorced me, saying I was destroying their family dynamic. My wife didn't back down. She told him that if he couldn't respect her marriage, she would have no choice but to distance herself from him. Her brothers quickly followed their father's lead, cutting contact with her in protest. While the temporary estrangement was painful for her, it was also freeing. For the first time in years, we could breathe without the constant weight of their interference. Update 5. After her public defense of me, the dynamic within the family shifted. Some extended family members began reaching out to express their support, acknowledging the courage it took for my wife to stand up to her father. Meanwhile, my father-in-law sent a carefully worded apology letter. While it wasn't entirely free of excuses, it was a significant step toward acknowledging his overstepping. My wife wanted to meet him to discuss reconciliation. I was hesitant but agreed, provided we set clear boundaries going forward. During the meeting, her father admitted he'd been wrong in certain areas but still struggled to understand why his behavior had caused so much tension. I laid out our rules one more time: no unannounced visits, no undermining our decisions, and no attempts to control our household. While he reluctantly agreed, I could tell he was doing it more for my wife's sake than out of genuine understanding. Her brothers remained distant, but I didn't mind. They stopped posting cryptic social media messages, and while our interactions at family gatherings remained polite but cold, I considered it progress. My wife, for her part, proved her loyalty time and again. Whenever her family tried to test our boundaries, she stood firm, making it clear that our marriage was her priority. One day, my father-in-law tried to push the limits by dropping something off at the house unannounced. My wife intercepted him at the door and reminded him that he needed to call first. When he argued, she didn't waver. He left, visibly upset, but it was a defining moment. For the first time, he seemed to grasp that the rules applied to him too. Looking back, in the months that followed, the peace in our home began to feel real. The constant drama had faded, and we started rebuilding trust in our relationship. My wife thanked me one evening for my patience and strength throughout the ordeal. It was a relief to finally feel like we were a team again. To celebrate this new chapter, we planned a much-needed vacation, just the two of us. It was the first time in years we'd focused entirely on ourselves without the shadow of her family looming over us. Not long after, we received the happiest news: we were expecting our first child. The announcement brought new challenges, as her father reached out again, expressing a cautious desire to be involved in the baby's life. I made it clear that his involvement would depend on his ability to respect our rules. No unannounced visits, no undermining our parenting decisions, and absolutely no drama. To my surprise, he respected these boundaries and has since made a genuine effort to improve. My brothers-in-law have also begun reaching out. While our relationship is far from repaired, we've had a few civil conversations, and I'm cautiously optimistic that things might improve over time. Through all of this, I've realized how many people face similar struggles with overbearing in-laws. I've started mentoring others in online forums and local support groups, sharing the lessons I've learned about setting boundaries and standing firm. Helping others navigate these challenges has given me a new sense of purpose. Today, our home feels like a sanctuary. We've renovated the living room, transforming it from a space filled with resentment into one that reflects us. Every time I walk through the door, I feel pride, not just in the changes we made to the house, but in the strength we found as a couple. Looking back, the journey wasn't easy, but it was worth it. My wife's family no longer has the same hold over us, and we've grown closer than ever. The lessons we've learned about boundaries and resilience will stay with us for the rest of our lives. And as we prepare for the arrival of our child, I know one thing for sure: our family will be built on love, respect, and the hard-earned peace we've created together. Thank you for watching the video. Subscribe and turn on notifications to be the first to have radish and real stories with you. Have a great day.